You know, no matter how hard society tries to eliminate them, we will always have biases, and they come in all types and shades. But there are some that tend to cover more than one situation. So I'm going to learn you some of the most common biases you're going to encounter. First up is the Decoy Effect. This bias is when consumers change their preference between two options when a third, less attractive option is introduced. Businesses love to use this one. One such example might be choosing between a small and large popcorn at the movies, and then being introduced to a medium size that's only slightly cheaper than the large. Suddenly, the large popcorn seems like a way better deal, even if you were originally content with the small. Yet another way we see how the consumer is manipulated. Next up is the Dunning-Kruger Effect. This one happens when people with low ability in a task overestimate their competence, while experts in the same field underestimate theirs. If you play video games, especially multiplayer, you've no doubt come across that elitist who thinks he's the greatest in the world, but he can barely handle a mid-level boss. Meanwhile, a ranked player with a world record is humble and tends to downplay their skill. Moving on, we've got the mere exposure effect. This one is simple but strong. The more you're exposed to something, the more you tend to like it. It's why that catchy pop song grows on you after you've heard it a million times on the radio, or when you grew up into an adult and started acquiring a taste for a food that you thought was repulsive as a kid. Be proud, means you've matured. The next one is how we attribute the causes of our behavior differently for ourselves versus others. If we make a mistake, we tend to blame external factors like circumstances or luck. Yet when someone else messes up, we attribute it to their internal characteristics or personality. It's like if you trip and fall, it's because the sidewalk is uneven, but if your friend does the same thing, it's because they're clumsy. There's a simple way to eliminate this bias. Start practicing personal responsibility. It'll help you in the long run. The halo effect is when the overall impression of a person, brand, or thing influences how we think and feel about their character. Basically, if we see someone or something in a positive light in one area, that halo extends to our perception of them in other areas. It's one of the reasons why celebrities can get away with questionable behavior. Because so many of us are blinded by their charm and talent, we might overlook their flaws. But that halo can turn into horns pretty quick. If we have a negative impression of someone or something, then it casts a shadow over everything else about them, even if it's not deserved. This bias highlights the importance that we are all human, flaws and all, and we should always keep realistic expectations of one another. This next one happens when a collective belief gains more and more plausibility through its increasing reputation in public discourse. Availability cascade is like that urban legend that everyone seems to know. The more people think about it, the more it seems like it might be true, even if there's no real evidence to support it. It's almost like that guy who puffs himself out and makes everybody think he's a high-status individual, when in fact he's really nobody. Hey, before we continue, if you enjoy this kind of content, we really would appreciate it if you'd subscribe and like this video. We want to reach and help as many people as possible through this channel, and we'd appreciate your help in doing so. Thanks in advance. And now back to the video. The framing effect deals with how the way information is presented to us can influence decisions. Imagine you need to have surgery, and your surgeon tells you it has a 90% survival rate. You probably feel pretty good about it, but if they instead said there was a 10% chance of you not making it, suddenly it seems a bit riskier, even though the two statements mean the same thing. This bias is exactly why politicians and marketeers are so careful about how they phrase things. The way they say or frame an issue can make all the difference in how we, the public, perceive it. Have you ever been told that you tend to bury your head in the sand? If so, you have this bias. The Ostrich Effect happens when we actively avoid information that we perceive as potentially unpleasant or uncomfortable, even if the information is actually useful. Kind of like that pile of bills you keep avoiding opening because you don't want to know how much you owe, or that weird mole that you're afraid to get checked out by a doctor. Of course, nobody likes to hear information that's disquieting, but we gotta realize that sometimes it's that very information that we need the most. The anchoring bias refers to our tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive about a topic when making decisions or estimates. This happens a lot if someone is impatiently shopping for something. This is a bias that car dealers love to hit you with. They often start with the highest price because they know that number will usually stick in your mind, influencing your perception of lower offers. The next one explains the phrase hindsight is 20/20. The hindsight bias happens when we look at past events and perceive them as having been more predictable than they actually were at the time. Kind of like when your team loses a big game and suddenly everyone's an expert on what plays they should have run or what players should have been benched. Hindsight bias bias is why it's so easy to look back on history, especially negative events, and think, well, of course that was going to happen. Easy to say nowadays, but we should never forget to learn from the lessons of history and not forget about them, lest they be destined to repeat themselves. In-group bias refers to our tendency to favor members of our own group or those who share our interests over other groups. This bias is often why people feel an instant connection with others who share their hometown, alma mater, or favorite sports team. It gives the perception that they're one of us, and therefore we view them more positively. Of course, the flip side is that we often view members of outgroups more negatively, even if there isn't a good reason to do so. This bias is a good lesson in being open-minded. You never know what you can learn from other people. If you care a lot about appearance, this next bias means you. The spotlight effect refers to our tendency to overestimate how much other people notice our appearance or behavior. It's like when you walk into a room and you're convinced that everyone is going to notice that tiny little stain on your shirt, when in reality, most people completely miss it. This bias is often why we feel self-conscious in public situations, especially if you're introverted. You assume that everyone is paying the same amount of attention to yourself that you are. Usually, though, that isn't the case. This next one can cause distortions of the truth depending upon what you look for. Confirmation bias refers to our tendency to seek out and interpret information in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs, while ignoring or rejecting information that contradicts those beliefs. It's why two people can look at the same evidence and come to completely different conclusions. We're all prone to cherry-picking the bits and pieces that support what we already think. While it'd be difficult to find anyone not affected by this bias, as long as you practice open-mindedness, you can limit it as much as possible. This next one proves the importance of critical thinking. The bandwagon effect refers to our tendency to adopt beliefs or behaviors simply because a lot of other people are doing the same thing. It's why fads and trends catch on so quickly. Once a critical mass of people starts doing something, it can create a snowball effect, where more and more people jump on the bandwagon. The bandwagon effect proves the power of peer pressure, so if a lot of people are doing something that seems dangerous to you, maybe choose another fad. Choice supportive bias refers to our tendency to retroactively ascribe positive attributes to choices we've made and negative attributes to the options we didn't choose. It's why when you're deciding between two job offers, the one you end up going with always seems to have been the clear best choice in hindsight, even if the decision at the time was tough. Choice supportive bias is a way for our brains to reduce cognitive dissonance. By convincing ourselves we made the right call, we avoid the uncomfortable feeling of regret or self-doubt. Basically, have confidence in your decisions, unless they ended up really badly. The next one probably explains our tendency to be influenced by sensation. The availability heuristic refers to our tendency to overestimate the likelihood or importance of things that we can easily recall, usually because they're recent, emotionally charged, or frequently talked about. For instance, car crashes are pretty typical tragedies around the world. They happen almost every day, but plane crashes, while much rarer, are far more sensationalized and talked about. They're big, dramatic events that stick in our minds, so we perceive them as a bigger threat. In other words, you should always practice putting events that are big and dramatic into perspective as to how likely they actually are. This one is simple but sneaky. The more we hear a piece of information repeated, the more likely we are to believe it's true, regardless of the reality behind it. It's why that catchy false rumor seems to stick in your mind, even if you know it's not true. The constant repetition gives it a veneer of trustworthiness. This is another one of those things that politicians love to hit people with. This one refers to our tendency to think that future probabilities are affected by past events, when in reality, they're unrelated. Gambler's fallacy is like when you're playing roulette and you see the last 10 spins have all landed on red. You might think that black is due to come up next, but in reality, each spin is completely independent, with each one having the same odds. This fallacy is why people get sucked into losing streaks. They keep betting more and more, convinced that their luck will turn around soon, when in fact, they're just digging themselves deeper into a hole. This one is pretty self-explanatory. The overconfidence bias refers to our tendency to have excessive confidence in our own abilities, judgments, and decisions. Like that guy at the poker table who keeps raising the stakes, convinced he's got a better hand, even when the odds are against him. Overconfidence is why we often take on more than we can handle, or underestimate the risks involved in a decision. Some of us have such a sense of "it could never happen to me" that we don't stop to consider the possibility that we might be wrong. The next one could easily tie into the previous one. The hard-easy effect refers to our tendency to overestimate our ability to complete hard tasks, and underestimate our ability to complete easy ones. It's why that DIY home renovation project always seems to take twice as long as you thought it would. You figured, hey, how hard can it be? And dove in head first, only to realize that you were in way over your head. On the flip side, the hard-easy effect is also why we sometimes procrastinate on simple tasks. We figure they'll be a breeze, so we put them off until the last minute, only to scramble to get them done in time. Sounds like almost every high school student ever. And last but not least, the egocentric bias. This one refers to our tendency to rely too heavily on our own perspective and have difficulty seeing things from other people's point of view. It's why in an argument we often feel like we're the only one making any sense. We're so convinced that our view is right that we can't fathom why anyone else could see something differently. Say it with me. Open-mindedness. And that concludes our tour of some of the most common and pervasive cognitive biases out there. Every person alive has at least one of these biases, and while it doesn't make us bad people, it does remind us that we should always be mindful of the things we believe, and be open to expanding our mind with other perspectives, to a reasonable degree at least. Did any of these biases resonate with you? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. And if you found this video helpful and entertaining, and maybe even spurred an introspection of yourself, we'd sure appreciate if you'd like and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Thanks for watching. And until next time, keep your mind open and those biases in check.